So let's begin with our orchestration with Docker Compose. So we are gonna start with Docker Compose. We will use multiple containers, and we'll make those multiple containers talking to each other using Docker Compose. So why to wait? Let's jump into the Docker Compose. You saw how to connect containers with links, and we mentioned the advantages provided by a clear statement of container dependencies. But unfortunately, links have a number of disadvantages. They have to be manually specified when starting each container. So containers have to be started in the correct order. So no loops in container linking. So, and there is no way to replace a link. If you remember in our Docker's part 1 video, that's containerization, Docker containerization, there we have discussed how to link two containers. If you remember, we have done a demonstration of linking two container, a WordPress and SQL both. Okay, so that is one way of linking two containers or three containers. But the problem with that linking is links have a number of disadvantages. What are those? They have to be manually specified when starting each container. Containers have to be started in the correct order, and here we do not have a loops in linking. So, and there is no way to replace a link also. So, if, for example, if a container dies, even every dependent container must be restarted to create the link or links. So fortunately, tools exist to address these pain points. Those are our orchestration tools. So we had just discussed in our previous slide about orchestration tool, and we are going to look into Docker Compose. So let's look into the simple Docker Compose, and we will look into the whole documentation and installation, and we will do at least 5 to 6 examples using Docker Compose. So Docker Compose, it started life as a fig, no, a now deprecated independent effort to ease the pain of starting a multiple containers with appropriate arguments for linking volumes and ports. And so Docker incorporation liked this so much, they acquired it, gave it a makeover, and released it with a new name. And now it's called as the Docker Compose. Welcome to the Docker Compose world of container orchestration. So this technique introduces you to Docker Compose using a simple example of Docker container orchestration that we are going to look into that now. So here the problem statement for us is we want to coordinate linked containers on our host machine, but how can we do that? The solution for this is ultimately at this moment it is Docker Compose. We have many other tools, Kubernetes also, but Kubernetes would be overkill for small if you have a less number of containers and small applications. So, but here in this case, we are going to use Docker Compose. So Docker Compose, what is Docker Compose? A Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running complex Docker applications. So let's begin with Docker Compose installation. We will do the Docker Compose installation and then we will proceed further. Yes, we have done SSH into our Docker Compose server. So let me do sudo I and clear the screen. And so who am I? That's a root user. That's fine. So now let's begin our Docker Compose installation. For that we have to get into the Docker Compose. Yeah, yeah. Okay, let me open that. Docker Compose documentation, and let's click on overview documentation, and here you could see Docker desktop, Docker engine, Docker build, but here we want Docker Compose. So let me click on Docker Compose, and let's start with overview. Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container. You see that? Multi-container Docker applications. With Compose, what do? We use a YAML file, YAML file, to configure your application services. Then with a single command, you create and start all the services from our configuration. That's the power of Docker Compose. So Compose works in all environments, either production, staging, development, testing, as well as CI workflows. So we'll have a different environments when developing an application in their complete life cycle as SDLC. So the production, that's the final stage, staging, and this is just a prior stage of production, and then testing and development is the first stage of this SDLC, as well as CI workflows. So everywhere it works, and it also has commands for managing the whole life cycle of your application, such as start, stop, and build services, view the status of running services, stream the log output of running services, run a one-off command on a service. So here you can get into install Compose, try Compose, and here you will have a release note. But before that, let's get into the key features and use cases. So using Compose is essentially three-step process. So this is very important to be noted. This is what the Docker Compose is. So first thing is define your app's environment with a Docker file so it can be reproduced. First thing, you write your application, and then you write your a Docker file which consists of an app, which consists of an app's environment, or which consists of your application. Then define the services that make up your app in Docker Compose YAML so that it can be run together or isolated together. Anyway, we are going to do the exercise to show it, but still I just want to explain. So one is your app Docker file. Second one is a service that is going to run your application. So you will have two Docker files, and you build two images, and you mention those two images as a services in Docker Compose.yaml file here. So then you run Docker Compose up. So the Docker Compose command starts and runs the entire app. You can alternatively run either this option or this option, depends upon what kind of installation we are gonna do or we are going to do. So using standalone, if we are going to do the Compose standalone, so not the Compose with the Docker desktop such as, so we are going to do Docker Compose standalone installation. Will take the binary file. So that's the reason we are going to use Docker Compose up with hyphen. If you install Docker Compose with the Docker desktop, then you can use Docker space compose space up, this command or this pattern. So, but we are going to do Docker hyphen compose up. That's what we're going to use. An example for you here is, so version, this is optional. So services, example, this is a web service. Here you have written your Docker file maybe. So if you have written your Docker file, you just mention build dot and port mapping and volumes, and depends on Redis. And second service that you have is Redis service directly mention image Redis, and volumes, we have mentioned one volume, that is this. So log volume 01, so that has to be attached as a specifically volumes, because this is volume mount, it is not bind mount. So volume mount, you have to mention that volumes object also in YAML file. So once that is done, you can just say docker compose up, and it will spin both the container, and it will make both the container communicate with each other and work in coordination with each other. So common use cases for docker compose. So compose can be used in many different ways, since common use cases are outlined below. One is development environments and automated testing environments, and even single host deployments. It's perfect for single host deployment. So for automated testing environment, you can use Docker Compose D and then tests. So Docker Compose, an important part of any continuous deployment or continuous integration process is the automated test suite. Automated end-to-end testing requires an environment in which to run tests. So Compose provides a convenient way to create and destroy isolated testing environments for your test suite by defining the full environment in a Compose file. So you can create and destroy these environments in just a few commands. That's the power of Docker Compose. So you can create how many environments you want using your compose file, that .yaml, the compose config file. Okay, these are some of the use cases, and let's look into the evaluation of compose. So, so as we have discussed about the compose, the first release of compose written in Python happened at the end of 2014. So between 2014 and 2017, two other noticeable versions of Compose which introduced a new file format versions. So V2 and V3. So that is 1.6 and 1.10. Now we have reached to 3.9 version. So here you could find out the differences between the Compose version 1 and Compose version 2. So that version 2 begin with you can run Compose version 2 by replacing the hyphen with a space using Docker space compose. Of course, it also depends upon what type of installation you are doing. Okay, now we have seen enough. It's time to do the installation of Docker Compose. So let's get into the Docker Compose installation. Scroll down. So installation scenarios, uh, you want to install the easiest and recommended way to get Docker Compose is to install Docker Desktop. You see that? Docker Desktop. So let me open Docker Desktop. If you remember, we have installed the Docker Desktop in our previous part of Docker. So now I'm opening the Docker Desktop in spite of installing it because we have shown it. We have installed it and we have shown it. So now I'm just starting my Docker desktop. Yes, my Docker desktop is running. You can see that engine is running. Engine is running. So now let me get into the settings, and here you could see Docker engine, Kubernetes, and software updates and extensions. And here you can go for the extensions and resources. Docker engine. So from here you can run your Docker Compose. The simplest, the single cluster, you can easily run it. So enable Kubernetes or show system containers advanced, whichever way, or you can go for the extensions and you can install the extension of Docker Compose. But you can do it from your Docker Compose, but uh, I don't suggest you to use Docker Compose on your Docker desktop or Windows machine. It's time to now we are in, it's time to enter into production. We have learned enough. We have done enough experiments on Docker. Now it's time to work on production environment directly, not the uh, testing environments or local environments. So that's why I don't prefer Docker desktop for the Docker Compose. Let's so that's why I'm not going to use Docker desktop for the Docker Compose either for Linux or Mac or Windows. Let's look into the scenario 2, that is install the Compose plugin. So either you can go with this installing the Compose plugin, you go to the Docker repository and download it and install it manually. So we are not going to do that also. The scenario 3, this is what we are going to do. This is install the Compose stand alone. We are installing only Docker Compose. So let me click on install the Docker Compose standalone. And here on Linux, you have this. This is the process. And most important note before you install the Docker Compose, because we have to work on this Docker Compose. So I would like to highlight this point is note that Compose standalone uses the -compose syntax instead of current standard syntax, that's a space compose. So for example, we have, if you want to run a Docker Compose up, then you have to say Docker -compose space up. This is how we run. This is how we are going to run our commands in this exercise. And when using the compose standalone instead of Docker space compose up. So if you use it using some other way, then you have to run this. But anyway, we are not going to use this. We are going to use Docker -compose up. Okay. Let's download and install compose standalone run. So this is our first step. Let's get into our Docker Compose server and install it. So let me paste it and let me run this. So it's fetching, so it's done. So now so the first step that is mentioned inside that was done to download and install Compose standalone. So now let me do the version. Let me check the version as usual. As we have discussed, Docker -compose and then either version option. So what it is saying, bash user local bin Docker Compose. This is where the binary file of Docker Compose has been placed. So the permission denied to use it. So there is no permission. So let's cross check this. So here also what it is saying is apply executable permissions to the standalone binary in the target path for the installation. So let's do that. I'm gonna give complete permissions, not just executable. So I will give also chmod. Okay, yeah, chmod 777 space, and then the binary file is located in this directory. So I'll copy this and I'll paste it here, and let me, nope, yeah, let me execute it, and let me do ls l and space and copy this. Okay, we have copied it, so paste it. Here it is. So you have by and large all executable permission for owner, executable permission for the group member, executable permission for others. Others means any other software, any other tool, any other utility that is there inside this Docker Compose server. So it's successful. Now let's execute our first Docker Compose command. We will say Docker Compose, its version. Here it is. Your Docker Compose version has been printed, that is v2.15.1. This is version 2. So Docker Compose we have used. So let's get into our documentation. And the third, test and execute okay, compose commands using Docker Compose. So let's, installation is successful in Linux. If you want to do it in Windows Server, Windows Server, then this is the way. Run a PowerShell as an administrator. When asked if you want to allow this app to make changes to your device, click S in order to proceed with the installation. Then you follow the GitHub. Now requires TLS 1.0, that's a TLS. Then you follow the other step and installation will be done. So, and test the application using Docker Compose version. That is, for that you have to use Docker space compose space version. It's same, but here we are using, for the Linux it is Docker-compose version. Okay, so let's get into our server and we will do more with Docker Compose. So this time I would say Docker Compose and help, and here you can see all the commands that are related to the Docker Compose. And first we will begin with the Docker Compose syntax. So it is Docker space compose. It is for the other installations, but for standalone installation we will go with the -1. So Docker -compose, and here in between you can put options and then commands. So what are those commands we have here? So the commands that we have here is build command. Build, it build or rebuild services, convert, and CP, it copy files or folders between a service container and the local file system, and creates containers for a service. Down, we have up and we have down. Down, what down will do is it stop and remove containers and networks, everything it will clean up. So events, receive real-time events from containers. Then exec we all know, execute a command inside a running container. It's a direct action inside a running container. Then we have images. It's Docker Compose images. It will list images used by the created containers. If you remember, by and large, the commands are similar to Docker commands. Then kill, force stop service containers. Logs, view output from container, similar. Ls, list running compose projects. And pause, pause services. Port, print the public port for a port binding. Then ps, list containers. Pull service images. Push service images. Restart service containers. Rm, again remove stopped service container. Run, as usual, runs a one-off command on a service, one-off command. And start to service and stop services. Top, this is also important one, we use it widely. Top, display the running processes only. And unpause services. Up is very important and widely used. Create and start container. Down, stop and destroy containers. So version we have used with the option. So now you can directly use as a command version. So that show the Docker Compose version information. Let's check the Docker Compose version. Here it is. So that's how our Docker Compose commands works.